Good evening. My name is Sharon Wyatt, librarian from Chicago Public Library Civic, Cultural, and Literary Engagement Department. Welcome to this evening's program, How to Start a Business. This program is part of our Law at the Library live events hosted by the Chicago Public Library and Evanston Public Library. We want to help patrons understand better the complicated nature of legal information by providing reputable experts to lecture on a legal topic and address questions. The Chicago Bar Association is presenting How to Start a Business, and we want to thank them for giving their time to educate the public on these important issues. Tonight's speaker is Matt Formler. Matt Formler is founding partner of Formler & Formler LLP, a boutique corporate law firm. Since founding the firm in 2011, Matt has represented a diverse range of clients in transactional and litigation matters. In his transactional practice, Matt focuses on startup formation and complex transactions. He has assisted several founders and entrepreneurs on various industries with the foundation of their business. Additionally, Matt has experience negotiating and facilitating the restructuring, purchase, and sale of businesses and assets, equity transactions, commercial real estate, and licenses for intellectual property. We are in a webinar mode for privacy concerns, so you will not be able to turn on your camera or video. Please place questions you would like to ask the speaker in the chat or the Q&A button you see at the bottom of the screen. Using the Q&A button allows you to ask questions anonymously. I will monitor both, and once the lecture concludes, we'll ask questions of the speaker. Please note any very specific personal legal questions should not be placed here, but instead reach out to the Chicago Bar Association or our guests directly after the program. With that said, please welcome Matt Formler.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So as Sharon said, there will be a period of time after the presentation for you to give to ask questions, and I will do my best to answer as many questions as I can. And feel free throughout the presentation, if something comes up where it prompts a question, please put it in the chat and I will get to it after the presentation. So today's presentation centers on how to start a business. Before I do anything, I wanted to provide a disclaimer that this isn't legal or tax advice, and this doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. And if you have any questions, please do reach out to myself or another attorney or tax professional. So before I get started, because starting a business can be fairly complex, I wanted to start with a few assumptions that we're going to follow while giving this presentation. So the first is that this business is formed and operated in Illinois. The second assumption we're going to make is that this business is a for-profit business. It's not a not-for-profit or charitable endeavor. Third assumption we're going to make is that this is an operating business. This isn't just an investment or holding company that's set up. And lastly, this is not a professional entity like a professional corporation or a professional LLC. And the reason we're making these assumptions is because I promise you I could go down a number of rabbit holes depending on what type of business you're looking to set up. And while I'm happy to speak about these other types of entities or businesses that you're looking to set up at another date or time, today for keeping it succinct and clear, we're going to keep it to these assumptions. So the first thing that I always think is important when you're starting out, you want to sort of conceptualize a business is do your market research. And the first thing I think a lot of business owners or entrepreneurs need to do is they need to define their why. Why are you looking to start this business? And you can answer that question by kind of doing some digging, where you start to figure out, number one, why is this important to you? Why do you want to develop a product a certain way or deliver a service, do you believe that you can deliver this service or product in a different way that's a new way to bring it to the market, or a cheaper way? You figured out a more optimized way. You can also answer this question by doing some of this other research by gathering information on your customers and your clients, kind of figuring out who's your target audience, because you may be selling a certain type of product to a niche group of people, or delivering a service to a niche group of people. And you want to figure out who that group is so that you can best form your business and tailor it around that. And you also want to learn about your competitors in the industry. You can learn a lot from how your competitors are delivering a service, or how they're pricing things, or how they're meeting their clients and customers. So I always say to most entrepreneurs and business owners, step one is do some of this preliminary market research. And where that leads you is it helps you to sort of figure out these three fundamental kind of considerations when you're starting a business. So something I've learned over the years is that most businesses, regardless of industry or location, are going to have to kind of figure out these three things in order to successfully start a business. You need to develop a business plan. You need to determine what type of entity structure you're going to operate under if you're going to form an entity. And you need to figure out how you're going to finance the business so that you can actually operate and have the cash flow to get started and continue. So in developing a business plan, most people have asked me before, what exactly is a business plan? Well, a simple explanation is the foundation of your business. Think of building a house. You need to start with the foundation before you can build on top of it. And I think a clear definition is actually, it's a blueprint to define and communicate the business's objectives. And so what are the business's objectives, or what do you need to communicate? Well, here's this list below. What does a business plan contain? Typically, it's an executive summary. You're going to have a description of what types of products you're looking to manufacture or sell. You're going to contain a description of services that you're going to offer. You're going to have this profile from your market research about your target customer base or your client base. You're going to have potentially advertising or marketing strategies. And these strategies may change through the life cycle of the business. So your initial strategy may change when you hit certain metrics. There's going to be a forecast or a list of assets, liabilities, budgets, timelines. So you want to sort of plan out how much money do you think you're going to need to get started and to continue operating, and what types of assets are you going to contribute to the business at the outset or throughout the initial stages of the business, or are there certain liabilities you need to be aware of or sort of circumvent in order to successfully start your business. So I've included a few of these practical tips throughout the presentation that I wanted to make sure I just touch on, because sometimes these are things that I see as you're navigating through this minefield of starting a business. These are some of the mines that you're going to encounter. So one thing that I think is really practical here is, before you start, so let's assume you've developed your business plan, it's rock solid, and you're ready to start sharing it with third parties. You want to consult an attorney about potentially protecting the business plan, where you might be sharing sensitive information or providing third parties with information that would give them sort of an advantage, or they could misappropriate that information for their own personal gain. And what you want to do is have at least a discussion about whether a non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement is necessary in order to share that business plan. And before I explain what that is, just a few people or folks that you would share a business plan with, potentially lenders like a bank or other third-party lenders that you're seeking funding or financing from, or investors, suppliers and distributors, potential partners that you're looking at bringing in to the business, employees or staff, and then your own customers or clients. And the simplest explanation for a non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement is it's an agreement that defines certain confidential information. It'll outline what exactly constitutes confidential information. And then it gives the receiving party, who you would be showing the business plan, it gives them certain rights to review the information as long as they don't disclose that information to anyone else, with a few limited exceptions. And why this is important is because if any of these third parties do take your information and disclose it, and it does harm you in some way, you have some recourse, typically as outlined in those agreements. So I thought it would be helpful to just provide a few links for the for business plan resources. So two really solid links that I've seen, and I've had some clients in the past tell me these were helpful, is the Small Business Administration. The SBA has a nice resource library for business plans. And then also the City of Chicago has a nice resource page for business plans. And at the end of the chat, what I'll try to do here is, if I can, or if Sharon can, we can post these links in the chat so that everyone has access to them if you don't have time to write them down. But if you want right now, you could take your cell phone and just take a screenshot of the links to revisit later if that's something you want to do. I'm going to leave this up for about 5 more seconds before we move on. Okay. So the next really big sort of issue that I see, and this is something that I see more than anything, is really selecting a legal entity structure. So if you were to start a business and not form an entity to operate that business under, if you're an individual starting a business, by default, you'd be operating as what's called a sole proprietor. And if you had a group of folks where you had partners and you didn't set up an entity, by default, you'd be set up as a general partnership under the law. Now, those things do come with certain rights associated with them. A sole prop and a general partnership have certain rights. But that said, there's no insulation from personal liability. So somebody who's running a sole proprietorship, an individual, if their business is exposed to certain liability, their personal assets can be at stake. It's possible. Same thing with a general partnership. There's really no wall of insulation to protect your personal assets from the business liability. So that's one chief consideration. So here I sort of outline 4 different reasons why setting up an entity is important, but also which entity you choose to set up, they are different and they offer different considerations. So, entities have different tax treatment. So one type of entity may be taxed differently at the federal and state level from a different entity. There's different management structures and operating structures associated with different entities. These entities, while they do offer a liability insulation mechanism, they sometimes offer differing liability protection, and it's important to understand those differences. And lastly, these different entities have different types of equity, and that can affect your ability to offer equity to third parties like investors or incentive equity, and bringing in folks to participate in the business as a partial owner. So there are a lot of different entities out there that you can look at, but the 2 most common entity types that I see are limited liability companies and corporations. There are limited partnerships. There are certain business trusts. There's professional entities, but really what I see the most are LLCs and corporations. So what are corporations? I'm not going to go too far in the weeds because I understand this can be daunting to say the least. But what I will say is these different entities like a corporation or an LLC, They are what we call creatures of statute. So each entity is governed by a specific statute in Illinois. And around the country, each state typically has their own statutes regarding these business entities, or they follow what's called the uniform statute, where a bunch of states follow the same statute. So in Illinois, corporations are governed by the Illinois Business Corporations Act. And why that's important is because if you just formed an entity and did nothing else, the statutory language, the default sort of treatment of the entity is all contained in the statute. And that may be beneficial, maybe not. And the reason I'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute. But some of the chief considerations with a corporation is that it's owned by one or more shareholders. And it's allowable to have different classes of stock or shares in different series of stock. And there's a lot of reasons why you may have different classes of equity in a corporation. But it is something that's permissible, and it gives you some flexibility to operate a little bit differently depending on your industry, your goals. By default, I will caution you, I'm not a CPA, I'm not a tax lawyer, but the basic tax treatment of these entities, I think it's important to outline. So by default, a corporation is double taxed, as we say, because at year's end, when you file your federal taxes, the corporation itself files a tax return, and the revenue that the corporation generates is taxed at that level. And then any distributions or dividends from the corporation that are paid to the owners is taxed again at their own personal income tax level. And it's important to understand that. That may be beneficial, it may be not for you, and that's something to talk to an accountant about or a tax professional. There is something called an S-Corp election, and I'll get to that after I outline a corporation and LLC, but corporations can be taxed either like a corporation like this with a double tax, or can be taxed like an S corporation. And then it's important to note that shareholders are generally insulated from corporate liability. So essentially, as an owner of the business, in most cases, if something just doesn't work out with the business, where it fails, or it's just not operating optimally, and you shut it down and lose money, usually the extent of your personal liability is the consideration that you contributed to the business. So whatever amount you paid into the business is really it. Your personal assets are routinely safe in these situations. And then lastly, we call it governance, but the way that these businesses, these entities are operated is that, corporations typically have a director or a board of directors, and those directors or that one director make the day-to-day decisions on behalf of the corporation. And then major big ticket decisions are typically approved by shareholders. Now, you can be both a shareholder and a director at the same time. And oftentimes, a lot of my small business clients will set up an entity where they serve as, of course, they're a shareholder if they own the business, but they also serve as a director. So what are limited liability companies? LLCs are interesting because they're really, as I like to say, LLCs are infinitely flexible. They are sort of a marriage of corporate law and partnership law and taxation. So you can sort of do a lot more with an LLC than you could with a corporation. And that's really important because depending on what your goals are, you can really structure the business in a much less rigid way than a corporation. So LLCs are governed by the Llc Act in Illinois. And it's the same deal with the corporation, where if you don't have proper governing documents that you contemplate and consider with an attorney, the statute has default language about how some of this stuff works. You can have one or more members. So in an LLC, we talk about members instead of shareholders. And instead of directors, we talk about managers. And by default, a difference in an LLC versus C-Corp is LLCs are what we call pass-through entities. So the tax treatment of an LLC is all the revenue that's generated by an LLC is passed straight through to the owners. So there's only one level of tax. And that's the default in what we call partnership taxation. So similar to a C-Corp and S-Corp, tax treatment is eligible with LLCs, and that's important to know. There's this misconception. I meet a lot of folks that thought you can only be an S-Corp if you're an underlying corporation, and you can still be an S-Corp for tax purposes, but be an LLC for a legal structure. And then LLCs have slightly different liability protection. It's a little bit more, it's better for creditor protection. It's a little bit stronger than a corporation, but not much difference. So really the important thing is, again, the individuals that own an LLC typically are not going to have their personal assets liable in a situation where the LLC owes a debt or obligation, the company itself. So now that I've kind of bored you with that stuff, the next question I usually get is, how do you form an entity in Illinois? So let's say you make a decision that you want to form, for instance, an LLC or a corporation. So entities are filed with the Secretary of State of Illinois. And within the Secretary of State, there's the Business Services Division. And believe it or not, each entity has its own sort of division within the Business Services Division. And that's really important to note, because you want to make sure you're filing in the proper place and you're filing the proper forms. I have actually had folks come to me in the past because they meant to file an LLC and accidentally filed a corporation and didn't know the difference between the forms, because they do look similar and there are some differences. So I always tell people, if you're going to do it yourself, make sure you're paying attention to which division within the Business Services Division you're filing. And each division has its own set of forms and filing fees. And one of the wacky features, some of the entities like limited liability companies, you can file a lot of things online in an LLC. Some things with a corporation, but other types of entities like a not-for-profit corporation, you have to file a lot of those things by mail or in person. So in order to, the initial document that you're going to file an LLC or a corporation, for an LLC, you're going to file the articles of organization. And with a corporation, you're going to file the articles of incorporation. And you're going to pay the filing fee. And this link below, again, if you want to take a quick screenshot of that link, this is the link for the Illinois Secretary of State Business Services Division. And it's fairly easy to navigate. I spend a lot of time on that website, I should know. So let's move on to what sorts of things do you have to disclose when you're filing an LLC or a corporation? Well, you want to disclose the legal business name of the LLC or the corporation, the principal place of business, where is this business located and operating. There's something called a registered agent and registered office. Every business entity in the state has to have a registered agent and a registered office. And what that is that's an individual or a business that's located in Illinois and is willing to accept service on behalf of the entity. So what I explain to clients is the registered agent typically serves two purposes. They're going to receive your annual report. So each year that after you file your entity with the state, each year you have to file an annual report. And you're basically updating information and paying either an annual LLC fee or a franchise tax fee for a corporation. So the registered agent typically receives that filing. And then also, in the event that the business itself was served with a summons or a subpoena, like a lawsuit or something like that as well, the registered agent is typically the party that is served on behalf of the company. So as a corporate lawyer, I typically tell my clients, we're happy to serve as registered agents, for our clients, because if in the event there is a subpoena or a summons served on our clients, we would like to know pretty quickly about that. So after that, you need to list what's called the purpose statement, and there is default purpose statement provided on the form. So unless you're going to tweak that, you can rely on the default language that the Secretary of State forms provide. And then you have to provide ownership information, like who the owners of the business are and what's their address. And you don't need to list typically, how much equity they have. But, if you're filing online, you're typically only going to disclose the managers of an LLC, like the decision makers, and same thing in a corporation, the directors. So sometimes, most of the time in a small business context, those are the same people, but sometimes it's not. And then also with a corporation, unlike an LLC where you're kind of almost finished on the form there, with a corporation, you need to provide certain information regarding the company's stock, its initial stock. So you need to disclose how many shares of stock are authorized by the company and how many of those authorized shares are actually issued to the owners at the formation of the business, and what's the value per share of the stock. And so that's something I always encourage clients to talk to me about and their accountant. And then lastly, the incorporator or organizer. So the person or party filling out the form and filing it is what's known as the incorporator or the organizer. So it's important, you need to fill that in on the form. So here's another practical tip, and I think this is really important. Clients come to me all the time about this. Selecting a legal name for your business is not straightforward, because there's often this conflation of legal entity name and trademark. They're not the same thing. So whether a name is available to be used with the Secretary of State is not the same analysis as whether or not you can trademark your business name or trademark a brand name or something. So what I tell clients is the first step is you go on the Secretary of State's website and you can do a search to determine if someone else is using that business name already. So if you're going to use the company name Newco LLC, you're going to go to the Secretary of State site and search for Newco LLC. And if someone else is using it already, you cannot use it. You need to use some variation of that. And there is a threshold with the Secretary of State about what's permissible in terms of how different it is from an existing name. The other consideration is, even if it's available on the Secretary of State website, is there a registered trademark for this name somewhere else in the country or in the area where you may be infringing on somebody's intellectual property rights, which is, like I said, it's a different analysis, and that's something you want to make sure to avoid. Especially, I tell clients it's not the best start to your business when you have to already change your name and rebrand because someone sends you a cease and desist letter a month after you get going saying, hey, we already own this name. We have a federal trademark and you can't use it. So you want to make sure you plan accordingly. And one easy way to do that too is just do a general internet search. Go on Google or another search engine and just type in the name you're looking to use and see if it comes up in other searches. Is someone else using it somewhere? You should see. And then also look at the domain name availability. Is someone using that name as a website where you're not going to be able to use that and you may have to use an alternative? These are things you want to think about before solidifying a name. So once you get your entity approved by the Secretary of State and you get the filed articles in your hand or your email inbox, the next step I generally tell clients is you want to register for a federal tax ID. Every business needs to have one typically. So you go to the IRS website, which I've got the link right here for you. And what you do is you apply for a federal tax ID. And this is sort of the business equivalent of your social security number. So you're going to have this federal tax ID that you use to file your federal tax returns for the business if that's required. And sometimes you're going to need it for other things. For instance, in order to get a corporate bank account. So once you set up your business, if you want to get a bank account, you need to have your filed articles, you need to have a federal tax ID, and depending on what bank it is, they may ask for other documentation. But typically the big two are the filed articles and a tax ID. And this sort of segues into this discussion. You should always discuss with a tax professional whether or not you should file for an S-Corp election for your business. So what is an S-Corp election? The simplest way to describe it is it allows owners to sort of bypass that double taxation in a corporation setting. And it has certain additional tax benefits where, I don't want to get too far into it, but it definitely, depending on your situation, according to to a tax professional, it may be much more advantageous from a tax perspective to be an S Corp instead of taxed like a C Corp or an LLC. And you typically have, 2 months and 15 days following your, you basically have 90 days from when you file your entity to make an S election, or within 75 days of the start of the corporation or the LLC's tax year to make an S election. You can make an S election at a later date. I have had clients where their accountants have made S elections for them a year or two and operating even longer. The one thing you should know is if you can always revoke your S election as well. So if it no longer becomes advantageous to be taxed like an S Corp, you can go ahead and file a revocation of your S Corp taxation status. It's just you can't reapply to be an S Corp for a period of time, like 5 years. Now, where does that come in on the legal side? I mentioned earlier that you can be a corporation or an LLC and be taxed like an S Corp. It's important to understand there are certain restrictions that the IRS places on businesses that have an S Corp election. And that is, you can only have one class of stock or membership interest in an LLC. You can only have 100 or less shareholders, which is typically not a problem for most small businesses. I've never really seen too many small businesses with more than a handful of equity holders, or less than 25. And then the biggest restriction is that the owners, like the shareholders or the members of the entity, cannot be visa holders. They have to be US citizens or green card holders, and they can't be an entity that has multiple owners. There's very, very limited exceptions where another entity can own an S Corp. And so that's important to understand. So there are times where I have clients that want to set up as an S Corp, but because they're looking to bring on an owner that is here on like an H-1B visa, or they have a corporation that has some investors where the corporation wants to invest in their company, they can't do that if it's an S Corp. So we have those discussions. So another practical tip, don't assume you're finished on the tax front when you get your federal tax ID from the IRS. You want to make sure that you also explore whether you need to register with the Illinois Department of Revenue. So do you need to file a Reg 1 to get a tax ID with the state where you have sales and use tax or excise tax? Or what if you're a wholesaler and you're reselling goods? The certificate of resale that you fill out basically allows you to purchase the wholesale goods tax-free and then only be taxed on the sales tax only applies on the reselling of those goods. So that's something you want to talk to your tax professional about. The next sort of small bit that I always encourage clients to explore is really depending on the industry or the location you're in or what type of business you have, you may need to apply for certain business licenses and certain permits. And these licenses and permits may be federal, state, municipal, local, and those are things you want to research. And I always say some of this is legal compliance, but some of it is very administrative. And these are things that business owners can sometimes kind of do on their own and explore. And we help clients. And maybe you want certain certifications. Maybe you want to apply to be a minority-owned business or a woman-owned business or a veteran-owned business. And those are things that we help our clients with, but they're typically very administrative. It's filling out certain forms, really. So two big resources here is the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. They have a great list, especially the city of Chicago website. It will show you sort of, depending on what kind of business it is, it'll tell you what kind of business needs what kind of license and how much does it cost to apply for that license and how long does it last. And we're not talking about professional licenses, where I kind of mentioned earlier, one of the assumptions here is this is not a professional entity. So we're not talking about a professionally licensed practitioner of some sort, like a doctor or a therapist or something. We're talking about business licenses here. So I'm going to give you 5 more seconds if you want to take a screenshot of those links. Great. So I'm going to touch on this quickly, but I think it's really important. So the governing documents of these different entities is so important to running your business. You need to have the right governing documents in place, especially when you have multiple owners in a business. So if you're looking to start a business with 2 or 3 partners, what these governing documents accomplish is, in a limited liability, you have what's called an operating agreement, and that's between the owners. And what that agreement does is it sets forth who has what rights in this company, who owns what type of equity, what rights are associated with that equity, who makes what decisions, what voting thresholds are required. So if you want to make a big ticket decision, like we're going to sell the company or file for bankruptcy or raise money, what type of vote is required to pass that action and have corporate authority to go through with that? Or, how do we determine when to make distributions of profits, and how are those profits distributed to the owners? And maybe we should have transfer restrictions in here, where if you have a business with 2 or 3 people and one of the folks says, my next door neighbor is really interested in this business, so I'm going to sell him half my equity. Maybe you want to prohibit that and you want to keep it closely held. Or maybe you want to have certain rights baked in, where if somebody does something wrong or detrimental to the business, the company has a right to repurchase their equity at a certain predetermined value. These are all things that are sort of contemplated in these documents. And I tell clients all the time, as a lawyer, my famous catchphrase is, I don't assume the worst is going to happen. I just plan for it. And we always say these contracts we draft don't exist for the good times. They exist for these times when there is confusion about what rights you may have or what your obligations are. And when you have a clear document like this, if there is any confusion amongst the owners, they can simply look to this document and says, oh, I'm not entitled to A, I'm actually entitled to B. That clears it up. And what that does is it prevents a dispute from bubbling over and turning into a lawsuit that costs a lot of money. And it brings all of this adversarial kind of contention, and then the business, suffers. And with a corporation, you have bylaws, and you might have other agreements like a shareholder agreement or a voting agreement. So here's just a quick overview on financing the business. So there's, what I see is typically there's really 4 ways I see businesses sort of funded at startup. Either the owners themselves are funding the business. So maybe your business isn't going to cost more than a few $100s or a few $1,000s to get started, in all the owners or you yourself can afford to do that, great. You just work with the lawyer and the accountant to figure out how do we classify the capital contributions and put them in the books and records and the financials. And then the other ways is maybe you seek bank or lender financing to start your business. A lot of people lately have been getting SBA loans, where it's a generous period of time before you have to pay back, and it's a really nice interest rate. Others are debt or equity financing. So you may offer investors either debt, meaning you say, I'm going to issue a convertible note or a simple agreement for future equity, where you're going to loan the business a certain amount of money. And if certain triggering events happen, your loan converts to equity, or you have that option. Or you might just do straight loans from investors or friends and family. The other option is the equity financing, where you're giving away ownership of the company for funds, for capital. So you may say, I'm going to give you 10% of the company in exchange for X, or I'm going to give you this different class of equity that has certain preferred rights of distribution and, maybe down round protection in case, like you'll get your money back first because you gave us all this money, something like that. There's all sorts of things you can do that you want to flesh out with both your accountant, your lawyer, and sometimes even your financial professional that you work with. And then lastly, crowdfunding. I see, some clients engage in that, where you go on Kickstarter or GoFundMe. That is a viable option. Here's a quick practical tip on raising money. First off, if you're going the lender route, the bank route, you want to be prepared to sort of guarantee or collateralize the loans. So typically most of these businesses, unless you have a financial history, a lot of them are going to require some sort of collateral or guarantee, where if you default on the loan and don't pay it timely, they can come after you personally. And it's something you want to prepare for. Another really big sort of point, I'm going to skip down to that third point, is before you bring, so let's say you're going to raise money by giving equity away, ownership, you want to make sure your governing documents accommodate that new relationship before that investor comes in to the company. So you want to make sure that you really flesh out the considerations. Oh, if we're bringing in this investor that has these certain this certain involvement, does our governing document, the existing document, accommodate that and consider that relationship? You want to make sure it does. And then lastly, if you're raising money, whether it's through debt or equity or crowdfunding, what's really important, a lot of people don't realize this, is the sale of securities is regulated by the Securities and Exchange Act, the SEC Act. So when you sell securities, like an equity offering or a debt offering, or even crowdfunding, you have to comply with federal and state securities laws. And that means not only having certain representations and warranties and the right language in your purchase agreements or your equity offering documents, but you have certain requirements about disclosures you have to make. You have to make certain filings with the SEC in each state that the investors are in. So I always tell clients, before you do any of that, you really need to flesh it out with a lawyer that understands securities law. It's very important. I'm going to quickly just touch on this. I tell clients all the time, no amount of legal wrangling can protect you the way that good, commercial insurance can. So I can do all sorts of things for a client with ironclad contracts, and we can plan for every foreseeable scenario, and you still might have to deal with a lawsuit or a third-party issue, or even some sort of unforeseen liability. And what commercial insurance does is it really covers you in a lot of these situations. So the big, 4 segments I see is commercial general liability. So commercial property insurance, casualty insurance that'll protect your physical, business location, your assets in the event of natural disasters and slip and falls and things like that. Key person insurance is really important on the owners. So we don't like to think about these things, but what happens if one of the owners passes away unexpectedly or becomes permanently disabled and can't contribute to the business anymore? Typically, we will draft language in these governing documents like the operating agreement or a buy-sell agreement in a corporation, where upon an event like that, or a divorce or a bankruptcy, that the company has an option to purchase that equity back at a predetermined price or a fair market value price. And instead of the business having to fund that, if the business takes out what's called key person life insurance on the owners, that would fund or finance that buyout. So if somebody dies or becomes disabled suddenly, and I will tell you, I've had clients where their partner dropped dead suddenly on a weekend, and they call me on a Monday and they're shell shocked and they don't know what to do. But if they have that insurance, at least they know that the company isn't going to be strained on the cash flow front of having to buy that person's equity out. It's one less thing to consider or worry about. Cyber insurance is a really big one right now. There's a lot of, hackers out there, and there's a lot of online scams and phishing scams where if your business falls prey to that and you get locked out of your entire system, or a hacker gains access and holds your information for ransom, the cyber insurance will not only cover that, but help you get that stuff back. And then lastly, if you have employees in the state, you're going to have workers' compensation insurance, and you want to make sure you have employer liability insurance, or at least evaluate that. So I tell clients, it is definitely worth talking to a commercial insurance broker about the type of business you're starting and what you think you'll need. And they'll tell you too what they think you'll need and what kind of coverage. And it's really important to have that conversation. Really, the big last step here is once you get everything set up and you've got your footing, it's important to sort of look at, do we need to have an attorney assist us with drafting commercial contracts for our business? So if you have staff, do you need employment agreements? The law, I will tell you, one area of the law that changes more than anything else is employment law. It's constantly being legislated and updated. As recently as this January, we had major overhauls to the restrictive covenant laws in the state about what types of employees can have non-competition agreements and non-solicitation agreements. These things need to be properly drafted. Looking on Google or LegalZoom for an out-of-date contract isn't always the best option. Whether you have independent contractors or employees, there are different types of agreements you will want and utilize. You will also look at, are you leasing physical space where you're going to have a commercial lease? You want to have an attorney help you negotiate and draft that. A big one these days are SaaS agreements, software as a service. Are you going to have a platform you create where you have subscribers that use your software? You need to have the right language in those types of agreements. Logistics agreements or supply and distribution agreements, licensing agreements, where if you're a company that has certain intellectual property or assets and you're going to license those out, you need to have the right ones. And then lastly, the big ones we see a lot of are services agreements, sales agreements. So whether you're opening up, a consulting company or you're selling products and you need the right agreements in place, I always recommend that you explore that with an attorney. So I know I've inundated everybody with a lot of information, and I'm happy to answer some questions now. One thing I will note is I have a QR code up here. You can just point your phone, your picture app at that and take a picture. You can scan it right now, and that QR code will take you to my website, and it has all of my information. It has, our firm's information. So my phone number, my email, my firm address, all of that is on there if you want to reach out to me. I thought that was easier than putting all of that up on the slide. But I think now, Sharon, I am ready to take some questions.
That was very informative, Matt. Thank you so much. I want to make sure that everyone knows that our Law in the Library series events are always uploaded to the Evanston Public Library's YouTube page. But we do have an attendee who wanted to know how can they get hold of these notes. It's a great PowerPoint, but it's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, please send me an email. You can just scan the QR code. My email is in the chat. I'm going to repost it right now. If you'd like a copy of this this PowerPoint, here's my email address. Please reach out. I'm happy to send you a copy of it so that you can have it. And that's an easier way to access those links.
Does anyone have any other questions? You can place it in the Q&A or the chat.
So somebody here asked, if your business is registered here, can you have clients in other states? So that depends. At a superficial level, a good example is I am a licensed attorney and I am licensed in the state of Illinois. So, for me to have clients in other states that I'm not, licensed in is the unauthorized practice of law. And so if I have a client in another state, I need to affiliate with a law firm in that state that is licensed in order for me to help that client. Not every industry is like that. So here's a consideration I would definitely kind of throw out there. Something to think about. If you are registered here in Illinois, and let's say you have clients in Indiana, something to think about when you form your business, your entity, let's say you set up an LLC in Illinois. If you have a stream of clients in another state where you're doing systemic business in that state, what I would definitely recommend is exploring whether you should file as what's called a foreign entity in that other state. And the reason for that is because each Secretary of State in each state looks at your business and says it's one thing if you have a one and done sort of one touch client in another state, but if you're consistently doing business in another state, what the Secretary of State kind of looks at is if you're going to enjoy the fruits of this state, you should be registered here. And why that's important is if you're doing business in Indiana, you can be sued in Indiana, but you cannot sue someone else in Indiana as a business unless you're registered in the state of Indiana. So it's an important consideration. There is no black and white rule about when it's appropriate to set up as a foreign LLC or corporation in another state. But there is case law that talks about what constitutes not doing business in a state. So it's sort of process by elimination. And to avoid the confusion, if you're doing that scenario where you're set up in Illinois and doing a stream of business in Indiana, and you set up as a foreign LLC, you're going to maintain your Illinois LLC, and you have to maintain your annual filings here. And then you're going to have an annual filing in Indiana as well, and you'll be paying that LLC fee there as well. So, and if you're in a bunch of different states, it's really a case-by-case basis as to whether it's appropriate or not to register there.
Okay, we have another question. How can I protect my intellectual property?
So intellectual property it's an interesting concept. There's really, when you break it down, there's 4 types of intellectual property. There's trademarks, copyrights, patents, and trade secrets. And there's consistently there's confusion about what is protectable under the law. So you cannot protect a concept under the law. You can only protect actual bona fide, intellectual property. So here's a good example. If somebody said, I wrote this great biography about Abraham Lincoln, I want to protect the idea of writing about Abraham Lincoln's life. That is not protectable intellectual property because it's a concept. You maybe wrote a book about Abraham Lincoln's life, and your unique expression of that, of his life as you wrote it is definitely protectable as a copyright, but it's definitely not going to be something you can stop other people from writing about. They just can't copy word for word what you wrote in your book. So it's important to talk to a lawyer about what is protectable, how to go about protecting it, and making sure it's worth protecting. I see a couple in the chat, a couple questions. Let's see if I can answer. So somebody asked, if my son is registered in Illinois as an LLC and he wants to turn the business over to me, what do we have to do? So if it's a registered business and it's licensed, you want to talk to a lawyer about how to transfer that business from one party to another. There's different types of ways to transfer a business. You could sell the assets or transfer the assets of the business, or you could transfer the equity of the business, and they come with different consequences or considerations. When you buy or transfer assets of a business, you're typically not buying the liabilities of the company. Where with a equity transaction, you're buying both the assets and the liability. Why would somebody want to buy the equity of a business? Well, perhaps in a childcare setting, you have certain licenses with the state and certain registrations. It may be, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just throwing this out there. If you wanted to take over that business, you may need to get licensed, or you may need to apply for new licenses. But if you do an equity transaction, you may be able to bypass that and save yourself some time and strain. Somebody asked, how soon before you'd like to start conducting business should you start the process of filing with state, federal entities, in your opinion? So it depends. Filing, for instance, filing an entity with the Secretary of State can be a very quick process. So the filing fees are different depending on how quickly you want a response. So there's a standard filing fee. For instance, with an LLC, it's $150 to file an LLC in Illinois. And you'll usually hear a response within 10 days. It's typically running a little bit shorter than that right now, but during the peak of the pandemic, it was very slow because the Secretary of State was closed and there were no filings accepted. So when they opened up, there was a stack as tall as me, that they were trying to get through. If you try to file on an expedited basis, you're going to pay $100 more, $250, but you'll get a response within 24 hours. So, I think it's important to, and what I didn't touch on is you have an ability with the Secretary of State, if you're concerned about the name being available, where you're like, I'm planning this business for the next, in 3 months, but I don't want to file yet. You can file, it's like $25 to reserve a name with the Secretary of State. So you can file a name reservation and secure that name for a period of time. And that way, it's yours for at least that period of time. So those are things to think about. But typically, it's a pretty fast process. So unless you're concerned about the name, you can wait until you're fairly materially ready to proceed.
We have something in our Q&A.
Let's-
How soon before I'd like to start conducting a business? Should I start the process of filing with the state, federal entities, in your opinion?
Yeah, sorry, that's the one I just talked about. And
Okay.
by the way, like when you apply for an federal tax ID, after you get your entity, if you apply online, you will get your federal tax ID instantly. As soon as you apply and you click submit, they will send you, there's a link where you download the letter from the IRS with your tax ID. And by the way, I'm glad I brought that up, because I have had clients that will apply for a federal tax ID in their own, and they forget to download the EIN letter, and they'll just write down the number. And then when you actually need the EIN letter, if you didn't download it at that point, you have to contact the IRS. Good luck. It's not an easy process. So please make sure to download that. Somebody asked if I work with not-for-profit businesses in filing. Yes, I do. I have some not-for-profit clients. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to you about that. Somebody asked, other than an LLC filing fee, is there another license fee that's needed to operate a business? So yes, it depends. So we talked earlier about the need to file for certain business licenses or permits. Depending on where you're located and what kind of business, you may need to apply for a business license of some sort, and there will be an additional fee for that, as well as perhaps permits, depending on where you're at. Is the FEIN number transferable too? It depends. So if this is an add-on question to the previous question about purchasing or transferring a business from a child to the parent, depending on how you transfer, the EIN can be transferable, but depending on how you do it, it might not be. So somebody asked, can you comment on any liabilities in e-commerce that may be common as you operate as a sole proprietorship, which would trigger the formation of the business under a more complex entity structure as a corporation? For example, a business is a website creator, and another example is an e-commerce platform manager for drop shipping. So I would say that my official advice is always to form a business entity, because you have that liability protection, and it may benefit you from a tax perspective, depending on how you structure, where you may be a much happier person come tax time when you look at your tax obligations. But in terms of what you're doing, there's certainly foreseeable. So here's what I tell clients. There's a difference between something being likely and foreseeable. Those are two different concepts. Whether something is foreseeable just means it's something we can plan for. It's something that's predictable, whether it's likely to happen or not. Likelihood means if it's likely to occur, we better plan for it. So when I look at e-commerce businesses, you start thinking about, as a website creator, what's a foreseeable liability? Well, you're offering a service to somebody and they're paying you for that service. Is it foreseeable that somebody may be dissatisfied with the service, or say, you didn't do what I asked you to do, I want my money back? Or you opened up a liability because the way you structured my platform, my e-commerce platform, or you didn't outline in your privacy policy who hosts the website or whose obligations it is, where I had a client pay me through my website and their payment information was breached. Because unbeknownst to me, Amazon Web Services hosted it, and now I'm coming after you for that. I mean, these are predictable outcomes, whether it's likely to happen or not. So it's typically something I tell clients to think about is you want to have the right professional services agreement, like a website design agreement that says specifically, here's what I'm doing for you. Here's what I'm, here's how you're compensating me for that service. Here's how we can modify or terminate this arrangement. And here's what happens if some of this bad stuff occurs. Here's what your remedies are. Here's what mine are. These are just things that we think about.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Such great questions. So that's all the time we have for this evening. We want to thank our speaker, Matt, for giving such great information and attendees for asking such great questions. If you have further questions, please reach out to the Chicago Bar Association or our guest, Matt. As a reminder, the library hosts virtual Zoom, legal Zoom programs each month on various legal topics that are open to the public and led by attorneys and other qualified organizations. Please share our events among your networks, and you can check and register for those other seminars online at Chicago Pub Lib, ChipubLib, ChipubLib.org. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.